a whole lot of time. And the truth is that Father Sirico and his co-laborer, Chris Maurer, have founded an organization called the Acton Institute that's become an absolute bright light in a very, very dark sky. As far as organizations that are promoting the cause of freedom and liberty and virtue, it is truly depressing for me to say that, unfortunately, the vast majority of organizations I found throughout my life, as from a rather young age, very interested in matters of both political and economic freedom, I found a great number and involved with a great number of really outstanding like-minded organizations, but they all lacked one particular thing. They were primarily overtly secular. The idea of blending sort of anthropological foundation or root to the cause of free markets was something that I had to search quite far for, but I found it in the Acton Institute, and I'm thrilled to be a partner of theirs and a friend of Father Sirico's, and encourage you to go to acton.org, see everything that they're doing. This is a growing and thriving institution, and I'm excited to speak this year at their Acton University, which is probably one of the most unbelievable events that takes place in our country every year. Literally nearly 1,000 people congregated with, besides myself, an outstanding group of faculty sharing messages that need to be shared and giving young people an opportunity to develop a foundational worldview to interpret economics from. But without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce Father Sirico, who's going to speak to us today on the subject of whether or not we can be free without economic freedom. Many of you have heard him before. He's a tremendous speaker, and please give a warm welcome to Father Robert Sirico.
These microphones, when we vest to say Mass, you know, each vestment has a little prayer to it. And over the last few years, I noticed that if I don't have a microphone on, I feel like I'm not fully vested. And in some of the sacristies, you find these little prayers written in Latin. And I was in one sacristy as I was vesting, saying the prayers. And just at the bottom, there was a prayer pro microfono. And it was a psalm, amplify my voice, O Lord, that I may sing your praise, or something like that. So it's good to be with you this morning and in the presence of stimulating friends. And I am going to offer some reflections that, and here's where the shameless capitalist in me comes out, are really drawn from the second chapter of a book that will be coming out toward the end of May. And there's a postcard at the back. You can get it and order information on Amazon. It's available for pre-order. There is actually one copy that I got just before I left Grand Rapids. The physical books finally came, and so we're not selling them yet because we don't have a whole order of them. But this is from the second chapter of that book, and I think it ties in well, and I think it'll complement very well what Andrew has already outlined for us as a theological basis. I think sometimes when we speak about things, we speak about, for instance, the word freedom, people use this word, especially in American idiom. It's so ubiquitous, isn't it? But if you stop somebody and ask them, what exactly do you mean by that? They're kind of caught up short so very often. And I think that it's dangerous and sometimes very funny when people use the same word to mean something very different. I learned this lesson quite embarrassingly during the year that I spent in England. I spent a year of my undergraduate studies at USC even though I'm a Brooklyn boy, but that's a long story, studying at the University of London. And when I'd gotten there, my first time not being in England, but the first time living in England, I was beginning to absorb the culture. And just as I had gotten there, there were some fellows on the floor of the dorm where I lived, that is to say, to translate, blokes who were in my hostel, who invited me to go out to a bar with them, a pub. And so we went out, and there were some Americans and some Brits, and we're all sitting there in a semicircle, and everyone ordered something. Now, I don't know, some of you may be teetotalers. This is just a metaphor, right? I hope you're decent enough Reformed Protestants to appreciate a good drink on occasion. So everybody ordered. There must have been 10 or 12 of us, and the waitress took the orders, and as she took the orders, I noticed she wasn't writing a thing down, and there were quite a variety of orders to be taken. There was Harp and Lager and Guinness and, you know, all these in half pints and bitters and all of this thing, and she walked away and came back a little while later with this huge, heavy tray with our various potions on it. And she placed it down. She proceeded to place the right order in front of the right guy. And this was such an amazing feat of professionalism that I remarked in the midst of the group. I said, "You're a real pro." And everyone was silent. And they were embarrassed, and people were looking from other tables because I had said it loud enough for everyone to hear. And I knew I had done something wrong, but I didn't know what it was. And I turned to my friend who had invited me to join this group, and I said, "What just happened?" He said, "Oh, you've just called the young lady a prostitute." And left me to wallow in my humiliation. It was George Bernard Shaw who made the observation that America and England are two nations separated by a common language. You may recall. So freedom is a word that can mean dramatically different things to different people, depending on your use of the word, depending on the assumptions you're employing, depending on the context you're in. A kind of freedom that we are attempting to address here today, and that I am attempting to address now, is the kind that leads to holistic human flourishing, for the betterment of the human being as a whole, not just one aspect of the human, because if you then separate different aspects of the human being, some other part of man is left diminished somehow or untended to. And I think that that is the only way to sustain freedom over the long haul. Let me make this a little bit clearer. True freedom is exactly the opposite of what may be called freedom at some times and in some places. One example in the previous century illustrates this point. The Constitution guaranteed freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. I'm not talking about the U.S. Constitution. I'm talking about the Soviet Constitution of 1924. It actually guaranteed those things. At the same time that communists arrested political dissidents, brutally suppressed priests, ministers, rabbis, people of all sorts were sent to the gulag, houses of worship were shuttered or completely controlled, the press was hammered into line with an iron fist. Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev did all this, even while the text of their constitution said that they were creating a paradise of liberty. In the minds of those men, freedom wasn't about God-given rights that are inalienable, that are part and parcel of who human beings are, and that are to be respected by governments which are limited. It was about the free scope of the will of the proletariat. That's what they thought of freedom. And of course, they were the only legitimate representatives of the proletariat. This kind of confusion of what freedom is did not end with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. I suggest you visit almost any university in the United States to see the truth of this. You will find, particularly faculty, but many, many students, praising totalitarian regimes. You went to UCLA today and talked to many of the kids in the political science department about what they thought about Cuba, they would still think that it was the paradise, island of paradise for freedom and the proletariat. They speak about national liberty and equality. They talk about stamping or protesting for the pacific coexistence of the collaboration of all peoples. Now, why does all of this matter? When liberty or freedom can mean so many different and contradictory things, we're no longer free to have any kind of meaningful conversation about political freedom. At least not any kind of conversation that makes any kind of sense and even allows for an honest clash of opinion. Because if you have these floating definitions going on and somebody kind of shows you the contradiction, you just float out of it and come back again in a different way. To some, freedom means nothing more than the license to do whatever they want, when they want to do it. Like when a teenager wants to be free of all of these stupid rules. That's the kind of adolescent view that many hold of freedom today. To others, freedom means the liberty to worship God freely, according to the dictates of one's conscience, or the right to govern themselves through elected representatives. Franklin Roosevelt spoke about freedom in terms of government-supplied security and even welfare. Freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom from whatever. But the founders of the U.S. Constitution thought of liberty as something very particular. They thought of liberty as limiting what government was allowed to do, and their understanding of freedom was tied into an old Christian notion of freedom for excellence, freedom to apprehend and to do the truth. When the founders speak of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that happiness is not mere titillation, but it is virtue. That's what they meant by happiness, because the only true happiness that a person can attain is by living the virtuous life. This constitutional republic that they formed was, as John Adams put it so well, quote, made only for a moral and religious people, and was, he said, wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Freedom has a wide variety of meanings, of course, and some people think that of it as the ability to do what they know they ought to do, even if it is not attractive at the moment. Even if what they know they should be doing is not attractive at the moment. Because that's the real rub. Temptation is tempting, right? And sometimes to do what we know we ought to do is a difficult thing, as when a lonely husband remains faithful to his wife while he's on a business trip, or as when a former recovered alcoholic retains enough self-control to live a life of sobriety. For still others, it means what the great 20th century Dominican theologian, Father Pinakers, called the freedom for excellence. So let's look at what freedom is and what it can be. I think it's easy to observe when we look at human beings to say that freedom is innate in the human heart. And this is something that transcends culture, transcends language. No one likes to be bound or held from accomplishing, doing what they wish to do. No doubt, in more than one sense of the word, people have pledged, of course, as the phrase goes, their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to the defense of liberty. Over the course of the last century, we've seen countless men and women risking their lives as they swam through shark-infested waters or catapulted over barriers or dug tunnels in order to get from the context of totalitarianism into the context of freedom. We are simply built this way. It is an innate part of who we are. So what is this freedom of which we speak that is at once an irresistible goal and still so complex an idea that we become confused about what it is? Alexis de Tocqueville helps us get a grasp on it when he says, freedom is, in truth, a sacred thing. There is only one thing else that better deserves the name: virtue. But then he asks, what is virtue if not the free choice of the good? The yearning for freedom is, as I say, built into our bones. Human beings, of course, are physical. We are corporeal. We have bodies. And that means we're subject to the law of physics, chemistry, biology. But unlike other animals, the human person has an additional capacity to transcend himself. Even non-believers can observe this aspect of human personhood. For example, when a person falls in love and discovers himself more than what he was in giving himself away to the other, more than what he was previously. Both animals and humans have bodies, so what is it that distinguishes us? Animals are bound to things by instinct. Animals' primary relationship with the material is their instinctual relationship to it, whereas humans are bound to things by our minds. Our reason means that we can reflect upon ourselves and what we are doing. We can actually think about our thoughts. Now that's a unique capacity. We think and we are dependent upon the use of the reason, because it is the mind that makes human beings distinctively human. Consider the fact that the human mammal is perhaps one of the most vulnerable of all mammals. We have no prehensile tail that enables us to swing away from danger, no wings with which we can take flight from a predator, no fangs or fierce claws that can ward off our enemies. The human person lives by reason, apprehending reality and ordering reality, integrating and understanding and remembering and building. It is this rational relationship between the human person and nature that gives rise to property. Property is more than a physical object. Property is a relationship between a person and a thing, or a person and an idea. To own property is to be in a particular kind of relationship with something in the world, a relationship, moreover, that is recognized by others in the community who also have the capacity to establish these kinds of relationships. Some animals have a recognizable, if rudimentary, sense of what might be called anthropomorphically ownership, like when a beaver knows that another beaver possesses a particular dam. But what is most illuminating in such comparisons are the differences between animals and humans. A beaver cannot sell his dam, or buy one from another beaver, or rent one for a period of time. He does not lease the dam. He does not use the dam for collateral to borrow something else in order to launch a dam building business. You know, it's the first time I've read that line in public, and I'm glad it's funny. I hope it works that way when you read it in the book. But humans, human property owners, this is different. They're able to do things with the property they own because property exists in the context of shared human reason. And property is essential. Why shouldn't all property then be owned by all? The scarcity of all physical things is a feature of the world that we cannot escape. Utopia is something that does not exist. The fact, that's what it means. Utopia. The fact of scarcity means that there is a potential conflict over who is going to use things and how. Now, we can struggle over each other to grab and keep what we can for ourselves, or we can come up with another system rooted in private ownership that permits us to peaceably trade, give gifts, share based on our own free will. And it is this peaceful solution to the problem, which is the problem of scarcity, which is property. It also happens that this solution of private property demonstrates the interpenetration between our physical bodies and this capacity for transcendence, or our spirituality. We engage nature with our labor that our reason plans and directs. And we produce something from that engagement that did not previously exist. Not just another beaver dam exactly the same as all beaver dams and as all dams built by beavers have existed throughout history, but a Chartres cathedral, a Mona Lisa, an electric light bulb, a smallpox vaccine, a revolution in agriculture that lifts millions of people out of dire poverty, or more modestly, a garden or an orchid that feeds a family and expresses a particular garden's thoughtful stewardship of the land. These things are possible because we don't just relate to the material world in an immediate and temporary way. The relationship of human beings to things is not merely a relationship of consumption. It's also one of reason and creativity. It is that relationship that makes the institution of private property possible. The right to private property is not merely the control over a physical object, as my darling little dog Theophilus might possess his bone. Rather, the right to property is wrapped up in a person's capacity to apply his intellect to matter and ideas, to look ahead, to plan, to steward the use of that possession. Just as other fundamental human rights are not created by the state, but are possessed by virtue of a person's existence and nature, so also the right to private property is recognized rather than granted by the government. The right to private property is not absolute. No one, no matter how rich, has the right to buy up the whole surface of the earth, even if he or she could. And here's something controversial, at least to some of my libertarian friends. This right to private property is not absolute because people may not deny the bread he owns to a starving neighbor who has absolutely no recourse for survival. But private property is sacred because it has such close connection to human beings as creatures made in the image and likeness of Almighty God, creatures placed in the context of scarcity and also given the power to reason, to create, to transcend. The best thing that politicians can do in this regard is to enact and enforce just laws in accordance with natural law, to protect people from having their belongings unjustly confiscated. This is why cultures that have systematically attacked and undermined the right to private property have tended to wither. And those civilizations that have managed to expand the right to private property to an even greater number of people have tended to thrive. Rodney Stark, who wrote a very interesting book, The Victory of Reason, made this observation from history. He said, quote, "One of the great sad stories is that something that looked like the start of a real honest industrial revolution started in China in the 10th century. They had some small iron smelters, and they started getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and people who owned them kept reinvesting and increased production, and they got bigger and bigger. And eventually the mandarins discovered that this was going on and that ordinary people were getting rich, so they stopped it. They closed it down, the whole thing stopped and went away. A great historian of Asia put it well. He said that private property is not secure, and that's the first and last and total answer to why there was no development in the East. Close quote. The positive side of this coin is that 1,000 years later in Asian countries, in many Asian countries, they have begun to thrive economically and have moved away from the command and control economies, extending human freedom to large numbers of their people. Now, the same is true of religion. If the state strips away our economic freedom to decide how and where we may use our private property in terms of compensating doctors and nurses and physical therapists in exchange for medical care, if the government comes to control all of this as if these medical skills and private exchanges were somehow the government's property, then it suddenly becomes easier for the government to infringe upon one's right to religious freedom in certain important ways. And we have just seen, and we are seeing, an example of this. I ask you to consider the mandate issued by the Obama administration's Department of Health and Human Services earlier this year, requiring religious institutions to provide abortifacient drugs, sterilization, and contraceptive coverage as part of the health insurance programs that even those religious groups who are morally opposed to those things to do. The fact that a seventh of the nation's economy was placed under the control of the federal government, the fact that our culture had become one in which so many of us were comfortable with such a massive intervention, that we allowed that to happen, makes it much easier for the government to issue a mandate that now infringes upon conscience rights. So I think this is very important. It's instructive to follow the whole trajectory of this debate over Obamacare. Initially, it was supported, for example, by the American Bishops' Conference. But eventually, their support ran out because they feared a lack of sufficient guarantee for the inclusion of a conscience clause, permitting an exemption for church institutions and insurance companies from covering those services that the church deemed immoral. But this isn't easy to maintain, this distinction. And I think they're coming to see that. When a religious institution becomes dependent upon the state, when it advocates the kind of program that Obamacare was, political control inevitably will follow as surely as night follows day. After all, I think the old adage, he who drinks the king's wine will sing the king's songs, seems applicable here. The king in this case is the Obama administration. And they have now brought other weapons to bear in an ongoing attack on religious freedom. One is the power of language that involves a subtle but powerful rhetorical shift in speaking about, I don't know if you've noticed this, the freedom to worship versus the freedom of religion. Our founding documents don't really speak about the freedom to worship. They talk about the freedom of religion. While the two phrases sound similar to the modern ear, important differences come to the fore when we start asking certain questions, like this. Does the freedom to worship include a social dimension? Or is it merely just something that goes on in the cult? May one, for example, worship with others? And if so, where may they worship with others? What kind of zoning laws would apply? May they assemble and even purchase property for this purpose? What if their religion admonishes them to teach children? Or tend to the sick and educate future generations as an act of their worship? May they build schools, hospitals, universities? You see the problem? very simple. The freedom to worship all too easily becomes something quarantined from the public square, something done in private, and only in private if you have any sense of secular decorum. This series of questions also underscores the interconnectedness of personal liberty with economic liberty, as well as identifying the danger of surrendering, even with the intention of accomplishing good, one's economic liberty by accepting subsidies that may have at one point carried with them some requirements that eventually become at odds with one's deepest principles and morals. The debate over the Obama administration's contraception mandate is not fundamentally about contraception or even cooperation with abortion. It is only secondarily about religious freedom. The even more fundamental question has to do with the meaning of our private institutions in society, with the question of whether the government ought to be looked to in order to provide everything that a society needs, almost as though the government has resources outside of society. Is there a role for a truly private sector in charitable work, in economic decision-making, in education, and the moral formation of society, a role apart from the work of the government? Indeed, ought we to maintain in any real and effective way a distinction between society and the state? Or is every obligation of society to be subsumed, subsidized, regulated, and implemented by the state? Now, I don't think that many would admit to this, the efficacy of such a trajectory. And yet, such has been the trajectory of the American government now for many years. The earth, of course, is God's gift to the human race for our sustenance, the sustenance of human life. And it is given to all for our use. I agree with that. In Catholic theology, we call this the universal destination of material goods for all mankind. But what does this mean in practice? That anyone can have anything at any time and consume as much of it as he or she wants? After all, the earth doesn't yield its fruits without a human response to God's gift. Human labor and creativity are intimately associated with human ownership and the stewardship of God's creation. Many societies, indeed the Christian church itself, have experimented with various kinds of communal ownership and have discovered that there are some significant differences between the ownership by the state and ownership by religious communities. All property must be owned by someone. It's simply impossible to establish communist ownership over your winter coat or your shoes or your laptop computer. The idea simply makes no sense. And concentrated government ownership of property is, as we have seen, a recipe for disaster. This is no longer a theoretical conjecture. A political party and a half a continent ran this experiment in the 19th century, beginning in the 19th century. Karl Marx summed it all up in his socialist theory in a single phrase: the abolition of private property, by which he meant the property of the means of production. And this doctrine beget an entire political movement that for more than a century became the foundational teaching of the most brutal regimes in that century. The central delusion of all forms of socialism was the belief that an economy can be based on forced collectivized ownership. But collective ownership turns out to be no ownership at all. And what invariably happens in practice, it becomes the ownership of the political elite, the people who have the most political connections and who retain in their own hands power. Without private property, the state pretends to rule on everyone's behalf, replacing exploitation of private citizens by private citizen with a much more horrible exploitation of the whole society by a revolutionary elite. Perhaps nothing in history has wrought more suffering on a wider scale than this doctrine. Not only would-be tyrants and socialists have decried private ownership, you may remember the Pilgrims, good and godly men. They too were victims of this collective property delusion. In 1620, the Plymouth colony held pastures and produce in common as a matter of law, out of a mistaken sense that shared property would be more effectively productive. Well, the result was economic chaos, disease, starvation, death, and the near extinction of the first New England settlers of the New World. William Bradford, governor of the colony, said of the collective property policy that it was found to breed much confusion and discontent and retard much employment that would have been better to their benefit and comfort, close quote. So what he did was he drew very clear lines of property ownership. The result was the first plentiful harvest and, by the way, the first Thanksgiving. You never hear that discussed in public schools anymore. Even today, we give thanks to God who commanded us to till and keep the land and forbade us from taking what belongs to others. Privately held property, which can be communal, such as in families and in corporations where people invest, or in religious communities like monasteries, tends to diffuse power. And what it does, it diffuses the influence of any one pocket of people through the whole of society. Private property confers on individuals and families an area of autonomy, that is to say freedom, that is necessary for our civil liberties. When property is in private hands, it must be cared for and used to serve others if the owners hope to gain from that property, if they hope to pass on that property. The free enterprise system is, as Andrew already pointed out, not perfect, for the simple reason that human beings are not perfect. Every vice you see among human beings, you will also see in the markets they create. But markets are far superior to the alternative. Publicly owned property easily falls into disrepair because no one in particular has the incentive to maintain it. Hence, the institution of property provides a foundation for the exercise of stewardship responsibilities. After all, if goods are marketable, they have value not only to the owner, but to potential future owners. Now, you probably know this. I suspect in this group you don't need to hear a Catholic priest exegete Acts, the 2nd chapter and the 5th chapter for you. But just in case there may have been a straying Catholic who came in, let me address very directly this notion that there is communism in the book of Acts, that there was communism in early Christianity, Acts 2:24, right? Which should never be read aside from Acts 5. Well, I think it's unwise anyway to just kind of pluck scriptures out. We need part of a sound exegesis is to read the whole context. But Acts 2:24 says that the early church had all things common, right? And that no one went without because others would share. Now, various strains of theological commentators have expounded on this early practice of the Christian community and then the monastic ideal that it later inspired. It is untrue, however, manifestly untrue, that private property was either abolished or prohibited in the early church. And you have to go no farther in Acts than the 5th chapter to read the story of Ananias and Sapphira to see this. The couple decided to sell their property, some of the land that they owned, but rather than turn all of the money over to the apostles, they kept some of it back and they lied to Peter about it. Now, what Peter says in response is very intriguing. While it was yours, were you not free to do with your property as you wished? Take that, Jim Wallace. And after you sold it, was it not still yours? But you have lied not to men, but to the Holy Spirit. The whole moral problem here was obviously not the ownership of private property, which is clearly affirmed, but the deception that the couple engaged in. Christian sharing is emphatically not the same thing as socialism, for a very simple reason. Christian charity consists in the free will offerings motivated by love. Socialist redistribution is brought about only by force. So this experiment in Acts, the 2nd chapter, did not become the doctrine of the church. And this is seen by the Apostle Paul, who never mandates for his churches to give, but rather pleads with them and depends upon their voluntary charity to support his many missionary projects. Besides which, all of this would be a violation of one of the 10 Commandments. You remember, thou shalt not steal, which presupposes the existence of private property. Of course, this is just the surface of the Scripture's treatment of property. But, you know, it's easy to miss in the sacred texts. It would not be easy to miss in the sacred texts of all religions, major religions, this same kind of emphasis, the moral injunction against theft, common to most all religions, implies a moral injunction against violating the established boundaries of property ownership. Part of the whole property thing, then, and the freedom that we have in society involves some kind of understanding of trade, of contracts, and of interest rates. I wish I had more time to kind of elaborate on these, but let me just say that the freedom to trade is a necessary adjunct to the right to private property, certainly with regard to producing more property and enriching all people who engage in the trade. And contract is necessary because people are not perfect. If we all had perfect memories and if we were all very honest and we had great communication skills, trade could take place without written agreements. But unfortunately, we're not. We're fallible people. Contracts ensure the title to property and the freedom to exchange that property. That's what contracts do. A stable, consistent regime of contract law permits people to plan for the future and rewards those who keep their commitments. In other words, contracts reward those who associate with each other in peace. And I'll just refer you to the book to have a kind of discussion or an understanding of interest rates and usury and what the Scripture said about that and how we come to understand the development of theological thinking on this. Originally, what religious theologians were against was interest on consumable goods like wheat and bread and things that could not be separated from consumption. But eventually, this view of money as sterile began to change in the milieu of Spain in about the year 1500. By the end of the 16th century, moral theologians all over Europe, both Catholic and Protestant, were refining their basic understanding of interest, which now prevails in the economic literature today. So that's a very important thing. Another way of putting it is, if you prefer to save now, you must put off current consumption. If I prefer to spend now, I must acquire the resources to do so. We can make an exchange between the money I want to spend and the money you want to save. And so you agree to lend me money, and we negotiate a fee to put that to work. And that's really what the interest rate is, and there's a lot more that can be said about that. But what I want you to consider for a moment is what the consequences would be if legislation were enacted that set a low ceiling on how much interest companies can charge. Does this sound familiar? would we expect the amount of borrowing to increase or to decrease? It's a simple matter of supply and demand. More credit will be purchased at a lower price than at a higher price, all other things being equal. The result would be the buildup of more debt. The result would be the shortening of cultural time horizons. The result would be the overall encouragement of irresponsibility. In other words, the result would be the financial crisis that we've all just come through and are still reverberating from. Through its control of the lending institutions Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, the U.S. Federal Reserve held interest rates artificially low with the noble intention of encouraging lenders, the banks, to lend to borrowers, home borrowers, as Andrew's already pointed out. He must have gotten a smuggled copy of my book, or maybe we read the same things. They would not otherwise have loaned money to these people, of course. See, this is where the problem of what is called the moral hazard comes in, where there's an asymmetry of knowledge, where people are borrowing, not having all of the information ahead of them, in front of them. And so government interventions in the marketplace really are responsible for this. Moral hazards created by government manipulation debase the culture of mortgage lending. And when the inevitable disaster arrived, what was the brilliant answer that Washington offered? More government interventions in the lending market, which is a bit like putting a weasel in charge of the hen house he just ransacked. Today, the U.S. government owns the guarantees on the majority of mortgages in the United States. More than 90% of all new mortgages, where people are free to own and use property, tyranny can never hold sway. That's the whole point of what I wanted to make in this, that you can't separate freedom from economic freedom. When people begin to sacrifice the right to property, the right to exchange, when they sacrifice their economic freedom for some other perceived good, such as security or equality, they take a step down Hayek's road to serfdom. The lesson of history is plain. People who value political and religious liberty will ignore the value of economic liberty only at their own peril. Thank you very much.
Much, Father. What I'm going to do here is dismiss everyone for a little break, let you walk around a bit. They're going to need a little bit of time to get the lunch set up and so forth. We'll probably, we're decently ahead of schedule, so we'll probably plan to start lunch a little bit earlier, but we'll let them start setting up in the back. Go ahead and go out to the book tables, visit amongst yourselves, restroom break, what have you, and then we'll announce the lunch being up maybe in about 15 minutes, okay? Thank you.